Her name was Alison Parrott. His name was unknown, but they had his DNA. It pointed to one person in the entire world. Where was he? And would they ever catch him? Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. In 1986, Canada's largest city was still known as Toronto the Good. Parents felt if their kids took reasonable precautions, the city was safe. The case of 11-year-old Alison Parrott would shatter that myth forever.
I always wanted Scottish names for my kids. I think Alison's just a wonderful, perfect name, and it suited her very well. She always knew who she was. And she was great if anyone was having problems or if somebody was a bit on the out. She loved people and she kind of reached out to people and people were really attracted to her.
But the image in the public's mind was Alison the runner. It was summer vacation. Alison had qualified for 3 races at the upcoming track meet in New Jersey. She told her coach she dreamed of representing Canada one day in the 3,000-meter race. She would never get that chance. On a hot, muggy Friday morning on July 25th, 1986, Alison got a phone call from a man who said he was a photographer. As one of 3 kids in her age bracket representing Ontario at the U.S. meet, the man told her he wanted to take some publicity shots at Varsity Stadium. On the surface, nothing seemed suspicious about the photo session. The man said other members of Alison's track club would also be at the stadium for the publicity shots. Alison called her mother at work to see if it was okay.
She sounded a little apprehensive, but the apprehension seemed to be around the exact directions of getting there. And so we went over that a couple of times, and then she seemed fine.
Alison put on her favorite clothes, baggy shorts and a green shirt that had once been her dad's. She planned to take the subway to St. George Station across the street from Varsity Stadium. A passerby remembered seeing her on the way to the subway. That would be the last known sighting of Alison Parrott.
Whenever I got back to the house and she wasn't here, I started getting anxious.
Around supper time, the police were called in. They checked Varsity Stadium, but there was no sign of her.
I was sick. Because Alison wasn't a kid who'd ever run away or just wasn't, we knew something terrible had happened.
Suspecting the worst, police immediately launch a massive hunt. When news of the young girl's disappearance becomes public, hundreds of volunteers, including many of Alison's neighbors, join in. At first, detectives aren't sure whether Alison even made it downtown. But a surveillance camera in a bank across from Varsity Stadium shows her from the waist down, striding past shortly before 11:30 a.m. The next day, Alison's parents went on TV.
If you're the person who's taken our daughter, please, please, bring her home.
As the search intensifies, volunteers fan out across Toronto with posters of the missing young girl. Then on Sunday around 6:30 p.m., 2 days after Alison's abduction, her nude body is found in Kings Mill Park in Toronto's West End. The search for Alison Parrott is over. Her disappearance has turned into a homicide.
You can't comprehend it at all. I mean, you're just utterly and completely stunned.
Because the weather has been hot and muggy, her body has suffered environmental damage. Given how quickly semen deteriorates and suspecting a sexual motive, a pathologist takes vaginal swabs at the scene.
I hope that the body will tell me the cause of death. I'll be looking at the entire body to see what is abnormal. Outside that is the skin, the surface, and then what's inside the body, in all the body cavities.
Alison's body is then sent to be autopsied. The pathologist finds signs that Alison was bound and gagged and brutally raped while still alive. Based on the marks around her neck, he concludes the cause of death is ligature strangulation. With additional samples taken at autopsy, there are now 7 vaginal swabs. Using the ABO blood testing system, scientists determined the swabs contain male semen from the killer. The bad news, they're insufficient to test against possible suspects. But in hopes of future forensic use, the samples are refrigerated at the Center of Forensic Sciences. The evening after Alison's memorial service, her mother finds herself looking up at the first star.
And I said the little rhyme out loud that I used to, starlight, star bright, first star I see tonight. And because Alison and I used to say that together. And I then bent my head and I prayed. I prayed for forgiveness. I said all the things to Alison that I felt that I wanted to say. And I then had this sort of feeling of letting her go. It was a very mum thing to do. And I opened my eyes and the star had gone out in the sky.
Who had raped and murdered 11-year-old Alison Parrott? And would he ever be caught? Exhibit A, a vaginal swab, key evidence left by the killer at the crime scene. More than 20 detectives hunt for Alison's killer, but it is a daunting task. Because the caller knew about Alison's track accomplishments, men and boys in Alison's racing circles become suspects. So do family, friends, and acquaintances. Police question previous sex offenders, particularly convicted pedophiles. Some suspects bring their wives. Some suspects bring their lawyers. After 18 months, detectives have filed some 30,000 reports, interviewed 20,000 witnesses, and identified 1,200 suspects. But with no prime suspect, the investigation gradually gets pushed to the back burner. Around this time, the late 1980s, an amazing new forensic tool helped solve a rape and murder case in England. The tool, DNA.
Some of my colleagues have described it as God's gift to forensic science. You read a lot about people saying it's the best thing to come to forensic science in 100 years. It truly gives you an investigative tool to work with.
What makes DNA so formidable is its power to test minute biological samples, even degraded ones, and still finger one individual in the entire world. If investigators can get a DNA profile of Alison's killer, they will be halfway towards solving the case. But by the time forensic DNA labs are established in Canada, it's years after Alison's murder. Remember those 7 swabs containing male semen? In 1993, it was time to see if they might yield a DNA profile.
I think 1993 was just the right time to take this type of case and see if you could use DNA as a tool. To take the case to another level, to go from the level of, we have a case, there's a lot of information about it, but we just don't have that forensic input that puts it to another level of being able to identify the person who committed this crime.
The results are better than expected. Investigators now have a perfect DNA sample of the killer. All they have to do is match that sample to a person. Between the years 1993 and 1996, 75 suspects are tested. None of their DNA samples match the sample from the vaginal swabs. Science alone can't solve this case. Luckily, in 1996, Detective Vic Matanovic is heading up a cold case squad to reinvestigate unsolved cases from the 70s and 80s. Often in these cases, the original investigators were on the right track. They just ran out of time. But a cold case has plenty of time. In fact, almost everything about a cold case differs from a new one.
Because when you start off a new case, you start off with zero information, and then you build up on that information. Cold case is just the opposite. You have all the boxes of information, and now you have to go through the boxes, and in particular this case had at that time around 50 to 60 boxes.
The first question is, why this victim?
Alison was an 11-year-old girl. She was energetic. She was outgoing. Some of her peers considered her to be a leader. And she was very friendly, and she had the ability to be able to converse with adults. Yet, according to some of her friends, she was an 11-year-old and she was a little bit naive.
Alison would have been no match for a cunning and dangerous killer. The next question is, why here? Why this crime scene? Though there are photos of the crime scene from 1986, there is no substitute for a first-hand visit.
You have to go to the scene so you can get a three-dimensional view. And you don't do it just once, you don't do it twice, you may do it 10, 15 times. Each time you walk by, you have a look around, and you have to keep asking yourself why. Why was her body put here?
Alison's body was found in a dense thicket of bush, hidden from the roadway. Above it are 2 bridges. One bridge is for cars and trucks, and in 1986 there was construction going on. The other bridge is for the subway, so the noise would have drowned out any cries for help. In a fresh homicide, Detective Matanovic would have pounded the pavement for a suspect. In a cold case, experience tells him the killer's name is somewhere among the investigative files. The killer is in the box. Alison Parrott was raped and murdered in 1986. Now, 10 years later, Detective Matanovic is convinced he will find the name of her killer somewhere in the boxes of evidence. Thanks to 2 dedicated Vancouver police officers and a parole report from 1987, one name surfaced: Francis Carl Roy. Roy was a runner who sometimes trained where Alison trained. At the time of Alison's murder, he was on the lam for sexually assaulting a 19-year-old girl in his apartment. But in 1986, Mr. Roy, accompanied by his lawyer, had given a statement to police and had been cleared of Alison's murder. According to his statement, on the Friday morning, Alison was meeting her abductor at Varsity Stadium at 11:30 a.m. Roy was on a 21-mile run through Toronto's West End, having left at 9:50 a.m. and having returned at 12:13 p.m. Then he did some stretching in front of his apartment, met a friend at a downtown restaurant, came back to his apartment, and took the streetcar to work. After work, Roy headed back to his apartment, though he alleged he was sneaking around since police were still looking for him. As Matanovic reread Roy's statement, something nagged at him.
In the statement he says, when he comes home late at night at the apartment building, he's hiding, he's being cautious, he's looking around. It's pitch black outside, and he's being very cautious because he knows the police are after him. Yet why doesn't he do that in broad daylight? He's doing the stretching there. So to me, logically, that doesn't make sense.
Added to this, Roy's running route was through Kings Mill Park.
That running route took him right by the murder scene.
The detective now needs science to corroborate his suspicions. Though Roy's appearance changed drastically in the 10 years since Alison's murder, one thing was the same: his DNA. But in Canada at this time, police couldn't legally demand a biological sample from a suspect. So an undercover officer tails Roy to a downtown bar and seizes his discarded cigarette butts.
And we were able to generate a DNA profile from both of those cigarette butts, which was a match to the DNA profile from the semen from the vaginal swabs from Alison. And so to actually get a hit, as we call it in this particular case, was a very euphoric moment.
When Detective Matanovic gets the DNA results, it is almost 10 years to the minute since Alison was murdered. Francis Carl Roy was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Alison Parrott. But his trial will present a serious challenge to DNA evidence. The DNA is Roy's.
It pointed a finger truly at one individual, and maybe only one individual, because it was so powerful.
As a native Canadian, Roy chose to swear on an eagle feather rather than the Bible. But Roy insisted he had not murdered Alison Parrott. Then why was his DNA on the vaginal swabs? This is how he explains it. He had been out for a run through Kingsmill Park and had stopped to take a leak. That's when he spotted Alison's dead body. Some urge came over him and he poked his finger into her vagina. Because he had masturbated that morning, some semen was still on his fingers. Roy swears someone else murdered Alison, and the reason his semen hadn't shown up on the vaginal swab is simply because the killer had worn a condom. It was a distasteful story, even preposterous. But was it possible? Or was it just a clever con to cover up a murder? What do you think? While the jury was sequestered and trying to reach a verdict, the public discovered evidence about Roy's criminal past, evidence that the judge had ruled too prejudicial for the jury to hear. For instance, the jury did not know that Roy was a twice-convicted violent rapist who delighted in degrading and inflicting pain on his victims, one of whom was a 14-year-old girl. Nor did they know that just before Alison's murder, Roy was at Kingston Penitentiary, where he worked as an inmate photographer, and that he'd bragged he was going to use his photography when he got out to lure women and young girls. The jury was out for a day, then two.
I thought we'd have had an answer within about 24 hours. And that seemed to be reasonable. In fact, we got into the 6th day with the jury sitting out there. which was just unbelievable.
After 6 days, the jury finally came back. They didn't believe Roy's preposterous story about his DNA. Francis Carl Roy was found guilty of the first-degree murder of Alison Parrott and sentenced to life. In the end, Roy could con everybody, but he could not con DNA. This is now what Detective Matanovic believes happened on the day Alison was abducted. Roy had become fixated on Alison after seeing her around the track. He had probably found a way to talk to her and knew she was excited about the upcoming U.S. track meet. Then on Friday morning, July 25th, posing as a photographer, he used that information to arrange a meeting at Varsity Stadium. When Alison arrived and saw that the photographer was Roy, who she knew, she probably let down her guard. So it was easier for him to con her into believing that the photo shoot had been moved to Kings Mill Park. Then, on the pretext of going to meet the rest of the track club, he lured her to a spot he had pre-selected from his runs through the park. He then gagged, bound, raped, and murdered the 11-year-old girl.
You know, Francis Carl Roy is an evil, dangerous man, and he's in Kingston Penitentiary where he belongs, and he should stay there for the rest of his life.
The conviction was a testament to all the investigators and forensic scientists who worked throughout the years to crack the case, and to Alison's spirit.
I'd like Alison to be remembered for all she was, sort of filled with love, filled with spirit, filled with zest. And ultimately, that Alison's legacy is that she couldn't be destroyed by this evil. That Alison's spirit, who she was, and the goodness of the life that she lived has won out over this terrible evil.
Alison Parrott will always be remembered more than her killer, and that's important. The stories on Exhibit A are based on true cases. The forensic scientists and investigators are the actual individuals who worked on the cases. The names of the guilty are real.